When you look at someone who doesn't post their photos online, the easy assumption is insecurity, that they're hiding, unsure, maybe even lacking confidence. But that assumption collapses the moment you understand how an empath processes the world. What looks like avoidance is often precision. What looks like silence is actually control. Empaths are highly aware of what happens the moment an image leaves their control. A photo isn't just a picture, it becomes a trigger for interpretation. People project onto it, attach meaning to it, compare it, judge it, react to it. And every one of those reactions carries emotional weight. Most people don't think twice about that. They post, they scroll, they move on. But an empath doesn't move on so easily. They feel the ripple effects of being seen. So instead of participating in that system blindly, they step back and ask a different question. Who gets access to me? Not just physically, but psychologically. Because posting a photo is an open invitation. It says, "Here I am, interpret me." And empaths are selective about that invitation. They understand that once something is visible, it's no longer theirs alone. It belongs to every perception that touches it. That's where the control comes in. Not control over people, but control over exposure. They're managing the number of variables in their environment. The fewer unknown reactions, the fewer emotional demands placed on them. It's not about avoiding connection. It's about filtering the kind of connection they allow. Think about it this way: most people are comfortable being seen in fragments. A photo here, a moment there, a version of themselves shaped for quick consumption. Empaths don't operate that way. They don't separate themselves into pieces for public viewing. To them, identity isn't something you scatter, it's something you protect. And once you put it out there, even in a small way, you lose control over how it's assembled in someone else's mind. So they choose restraint. Not because they have nothing to show, but because they understand the cost of showing it. They recognize that every bit of visibility comes with a trade-off: attention, interpretation, and emotional input. And they're not willing to pay that price casually. What's interesting is that this restraint often gets misread. People assume distance when it's actually discernment. They assume a lack of confidence when it's actually a high level of self-awareness. Because it takes more clarity to hold something back than it does to put it out. And that's the shift. Once you see it for what it is, it stops looking like absence and starts looking like strategy. Because for an empath, not everything needs to be seen to be real. Now take that one step further. It's not just about controlling access, it's about what happens when that access is granted. For most people, attention feels good. It's validating. Like a comment, a reaction, it lands as a small boost. But for an empath, attention doesn't just register, it transfers. It carries tone, intention, emotion. And that changes everything. When an empath posts a photo, they're not just receiving numbers on a screen. They're absorbing reactions. Every comment has a mood. Every message has an undercurrent. Even silence can feel like something. And while others can scroll past it, empaths tend to process it. They pick up on subtleties. Most people ignore the difference between a genuine compliment and a forced one. The weight behind a certain emoji, the intention behind who engages and who doesn't. So what looks like simple interaction to one person becomes layered input to another. And here's the part most people miss. That input doesn't just disappear. It accumulates. It lingers. It demands processing. Imagine opening a door and letting in dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small emotional signals, some positive, some neutral, some unclear. For most people, that's background noise. For an empath, that's a full conversation happening all at once. That's why the idea of just posting isn't simple. It's not a quick action followed by indifference. It's an exchange. And every exchange has a cost. So instead of chasing attention, they start measuring it. They become selective, not because they don't want connection, but because they understand the weight of it. Attention isn't free, it requires energy to receive, interpret, and carry. And empaths are already operating with a heightened sensitivity to emotional environments. Adding unnecessary input isn't neutral, it's draining. This is why you'll often notice a pattern. Empaths don't avoid people, but they do avoid environments where attention becomes constant and shallow. Social media, especially when centered around images, creates exactly that kind of environment. It turns presence into performance and attention into currency. And for someone who feels deeply, that system becomes overwhelming very quickly. So they make an adjustment. They reduce exposure, not because they can't handle attention, but because they choose where their energy goes. They'd rather have one meaningful interaction than 100 surface-level reactions. They'd rather engage in a space where communication has depth, where intention is clear, where connection isn't diluted by volume. And once you understand that, their behavior stops looking like withdrawal. It starts looking like conservation. Because when you feel everything more intensely, you don't just manage what you give, you manage what you allow in. And if you keep following that pattern, you start to see something even more fundamental underneath it. It's not just about managing attention or limiting exposure, it's about where identity actually comes from. Most people, whether they realize it or not, build parts of their identity in public. They post a photo, they watch how people respond, and that response shapes how they see themselves. It's subtle, but it's constant. Over time, identity becomes a feedback loop. You show something, the world reacts, and you adjust. Again and again. But empaths don't lean on that loop in the same way. For them, identity is not something that needs to be confirmed externally. It's already established internally. They spend more time observing, reflecting, processing, so their sense of self isn't built on reaction, it's built on awareness. And when that's the case, the need to present yourself for validation starts to fade. That's why posting photos doesn't hold the same appeal. Because a lot of that behavior, at its core, is about signaling. It says, this is who I am, this is how I want to be seen. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it's a normal human behavior. But for an empath, it can feel unnecessary, even misaligned. They're not trying to control how they're perceived at scale. They're more focused on being understood in depth, and there's a difference between those two things. When you rely on external feedback, you start adjusting yourself to maintain it. You become more aware of how things look than how they feel. But when your identity is internal, you don't need to constantly check if it's still valid. You already know where you stand. That creates a kind of stability that doesn't depend on being seen. So instead of projecting an image outward, empaths tend to reveal themselves selectively. Not through snapshots, but through interaction. Through conversation. Through moments where context exists, where nuance can come through. Because a single image can be interpreted 100 different ways, but a real interaction carries clarity. And this is where a lot of misunderstanding happens. People assume that if you're not presenting yourself, you're holding back, that you're reserved or unsure or disconnected. But in reality, it's often the opposite. There's a strong sense of self there, strong enough that it doesn't need constant reinforcement. They're not asking, do you see me? They're asking, do you understand me? And those are two very different questions. Because being seen is easy, it's quick, it's surface level. But being understood requires depth, time, and the right environment. And empaths are willing to wait for that rather than replace it with something faster but less real. So when they choose not to post, it's not a rejection of visibility. It's a rejection of shallow definition. Because who they are isn't something they need to display, it's something they choose to reveal. Now, if you really want to understand the difference in behavior, you have to look at what happens before the action ever takes place. Most people experience social media in a very immediate way. They feel something, they capture it, they share it. The process is quick, almost automatic. There's very little pause between impulse and action. Empaths don't operate like that. Before anything is posted, there's a silent evaluation happening. Not overthinking in the chaotic sense, but scanning. They run through possibilities almost instantly. Who is going to see this? What context will they attach to it? How might this be misunderstood? What kind of responses will this invite? And more importantly, what will those responses feel like once they come back? It's not just about the action, it's about the aftermath. So while someone else might see a photo as a simple moment worth sharing, an empath sees a chain reaction. Because once it's out there, it doesn't stay static. It moves through different minds, different moods, different interpretations, and each one has the potential to come back with its own emotional tone attached. That level of foresight changes behavior. It slows things down. It creates a gap between impulse and decision. And in that gap, most of the time, the conclusion is the same. It's not worth it. Not because the moment isn't meaningful, but because the consequences of sharing it add layers that weren't there to begin with. And here's where the contrast becomes clear. Most people deal with consequences after they happen. They post, then they manage reactions. They respond to comments, they adjust based on feedback, they navigate misunderstandings in real time. Empaths flip that process. They experience the potential outcome before they ever take the step. They feel the weight of reactions in advance, almost like a preview. And when that preview feels heavy, unnecessary, or misaligned, they simply opt out. It's not hesitation, it's preemptive clarity. They're not avoiding action because they're unsure. They're avoiding it because they've already run the scenario far enough to know how it ends. And if the ending doesn't add value, there's no reason to begin. This is why their behavior can look so different from the outside. It seems like they're holding back when in reality, they're moving through a much longer internal process in a much shorter amount of time. Decisions that take others seconds are filtered through layers of awareness that most people don't even notice. And over time, that creates a pattern. Fewer impulsive actions, fewer unnecessary exposures, more intentional choices about what gets shared and what doesn't. Not because they're disconnected from the moment, but because they're connected to the full timeline of that moment, from beginning to consequence. So when you see someone consistently choosing not to post, understand this: it's not that they didn't think about it, it's that they thought about it completely. And when you put all of that together, the control over access, the sensitivity to attention, the internal sense of identity, and the anticipation of consequences, you start to see the final piece fall into place. It's not just about what empaths avoid, it's about what they choose instead. Because when you reduce visibility, you naturally reduce volume. Fewer people engaging, fewer reactions coming in, fewer interactions happening on the surface. And to someone on the outside, that can look like isolation, like they're cutting themselves off. But that's not what's happening. What they're actually doing is filtering. They're removing the noise so they can recognize the signal. When you're not constantly putting yourself out there for broad consumption, the people who remain are there for a different reason. They're not reacting to an image. They're engaging with a person. And that changes the entire dynamic of the connection. Think about how most interactions start online. A photo creates an impression, and that impression shapes the interaction. It sets expectations before any real communication happens. But when that layer is removed, something else takes its place: curiosity, conversation, discovery. People have to engage directly to understand who you are. And for empaths, that's where real connection begins. They're not interested in being quickly recognized. They're interested in being accurately understood. And that doesn't happen in a comment section. It happens in dialogue, in shared moments, in exchanges where both sides are present and attentive. So by not broadcasting themselves, they're not limiting connection, they're refining it. They're creating an environment where interactions are more intentional, where people who step into their space do so with a level of effort, not just a quick reaction. And that effort acts as a natural filter. It removes the casual, the superficial, the ones who are just passing through. What's left is smaller but stronger. And that's a trade-off they're willing to make. Because depth requires space. It requires time. It requires a level of focus that gets diluted when attention is spread too thin. By keeping their visibility selective, they protect that space. They allow relationships to form without the interference of constant external input. And over time, those relationships tend to carry more weight. They're built on interaction, not observation. On understanding, not assumption. And that creates a different kind of connection, one that doesn't fade as quickly, because it wasn't built on something temporary to begin with. So while others are expanding their reach, empaths are strengthening their core. While others are maximizing exposure, they're maximizing meaning. And once you see that clearly, the pattern makes sense. They're not trying to be seen by everyone. They're choosing to be known by the right ones.